Okay, good afternoon everyone. This is again a voice recording for Conservation 101, and this is week 5 of the lectures, and this week's lectures is an overview of population ecology and those different aspects that drive population ecology. So to start off, what is it about? We're going to look at population growth. What are those factors that affect population fluctuation? So we're looking at changes in population. So populations is a geographically isolated group of one species and the different things that affect those populations. So we're generally looking at increases and decreases in numbers and population structures, juveniles, subadults, adults, and cycles that drive those processes. We're also going to look at factors that affect population size, as I've said. Okay, moving on to population. What are the different outcomes of the lesson? We're going to look at the differences or be able to differentiate. You should be able to differentiate between different types of population growth, explain population fluctuations and cycles, and differentiate between density independent and density dependent factors. So densities is looking at the relative number of individuals per defined area. So you're looking at the number of organisms per square kilometer, for example, and whether there are factors that those cycles are dependent on, and those factors that affect the densities and those that do not affect the densities. We'll get into that in a moment. Looking at changes in population sizes, so the intrinsic rate of increase refers to the maximum rate at which a population of a species could grow or increase under ideal conditions when its resources are abundant and the population density is very low. So what they're considering here is when you have a population that's going to change in size, if a population is going to breed, consider the last week's lectures, and they're going to increase in size, the population is going to increase in size. If the resources are abundant, it will just continue to increase in size. Consider something like a herd of elephants in a pristine, beautiful environment with lots of food and water. They will just start to increase. So we're considering what are those variables that affect the ability of different organisms to increase, the population size to increase. Okay, and in terms of the population density, that's an aspect of competition. So what are the different things that affect the way that a population can grow? Different species have different intrinsic rates of increase. So different species increase in different ways, and there are different factors that affect the way that those different populations increase. Factors that affect or influence the intrinsic rate of increase include the rate at which or the age at which a reproduction begins of a different species. So if you have this rapid turnover of populations where they reach breeding maturity very early compared to those populations and those species that would only reach late maturity, that would affect the way the populations can increase. Also consider the duration of the individual's life during which an individual is capable of reproducing. Some species like the salmon migrations, for example, and some insects, they're born, they grow, they reproduce, and then they die. So there's no overlap between the different generations. So that also affects the capability of populations increasing. Consider also the number of offspring that the individual is capable of reproducing. Insects and fish, for example, can have many, even in some cases tens of thousands of offspring. In terms of fish, you can have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of offspring from one individual. But for an elephant, for example, you only get one offspring, and the gestation period can be very long. The age of maturation can be very long, for example, as well. And those are factors that affect the ability of a population to increase in size. In some cases, again, considering larger species, animals that grow larger, so we're thinking of larger organisms rather than species. Like elephants, they're known to have a smaller intrinsic rate of increase compared to microorganisms like bacteria because of those factors. Okay, assuming that the environment has unlimited resources, certain bacteria can reproduce by binary fission every 20 minutes. So that graph on the right hand side considers, let me just see if I can get a pointer going here. Yeah, there we go. Considers that the population in size will increase over time because you have this exponential increase in population rates. So if this bacteria can increase every 20 minutes you have a doubling. So you have this exponential rate of increase, and you have this shape of growth. And that shape, as you can see, it looks like a J. So it's considered to be a J-shaped curve will be produced when plotting the population size versus time under optimal conditions. So we're looking at those things that might affect the ability of this population to increase. A J-shaped curve is characteristic of exponential growth and accelerating the population growth. And that's an acceleration or accelerating the population growth rate. However, it may take longer for an elephant, for example, population than for bacteria population to reach a certain size, but both organisms will always increase exponentially as long as their per capita growth rate remains constant. So that's suggesting that even though elephants mature later and they don't reproduce as fast, you can have a similar growth curve for elephants. It would just take a longer time. So we're not only thinking of how much time does bacteria reproduce in every 20 minutes, for example, but how long would an elephant take? But it can still have the same shape over time. So if you didn't actually measure this variable, if this variable of time here was measured in minutes, you would have this shape for bacteria, and the elephants would be off the chart. But if this curve was in years, for example, or tens of years, you would have a very similar shape for elephants. So the point of it is to show you that this is the type of shape you can get where you have exponential increase in population sizes, but over time. But we're considering, are there other variables that may affect the population growth that may change the shape? So you wouldn't always have a J-curve shape, you have a different shape. Okay, it would not be possible for bacteria to reproduce for an indefinite period due to the shortage of food supply and the living space, and poisonous waste products would accumulate in their vicinity. So we're considering that now there are other things that are going to start affecting the way that populations can increase exponentially. And that's what we have in the environment, because we have a lot of these different habitats and niches and biologies of different species, and those interactions with those different species and the competition amongst their species affects the way that those populations increase. So consider increased population densities tend to facilitate the spread of infectious organisms, example viruses, amongst individuals. So that's just an aspect of consider that the way some organisms can grow exponentially, it has ramifications. The way that it'll grow will have secondary impacts on other organisms, and in the case of viruses, if they had the ability to reproduce exponentially and they had a very short life cycle, they would grow exponentially, and that could actually be very harmful. And this is an attribute of how different organisms actually compete and or interact with one another in the environment. Also consider that predation is likely to increase due to high population densities. So if you had an animal like an impala growing exponentially in the Kruger Park, because of the new increase in abundance of food, that would only start to facilitate other animals like lions. And the lion population will also start to increase. But you see that as the resources now for the lions start to increase, their pressure, the predation pressure on the impala will start to increase. And they themselves will start to affect the very resource that they require. So that's why you get these interactions and these life cycles between populations. These conditions will lead to a decline in the birth rate and increase in the death rate. With time, conditions might be worse and death rates would exceed birth rates, and the population sizes would start to decrease. So there are many situations or occurrences where, for example, and there's usually a relationship, we call it a correlation, between predators and prey, where the density of the prey population will start to increase, and as the prey population increases, so too does the predation rates. And as the predation rates start to get excessive and they start to affect the recruitment of new impala, for example, the impala population starts to drop. And if the impala population starts to drop, then the predators start to run out of food themselves, and the predator population starts to drop as well. So consider that there's a relationship between the two. The number of individuals in a population is controlled by the ability of the environment to support it. It Makes great sense. It's based on resources, available resources. Now, what's very important is these different resources and the availability of resources for populations is related to what we refer to as the carrying capacity of an environment. That refers to the maximum numbers of individuals that an environment can support. So in many cases, for example, in the Kruger National Park, we've got some idea of, based on the landscape and the food requirements of many animals, what is the carrying capacity of different species of animals, different populations that can be maintained within the Kruger National Park. And we want to maintain biodiversity, for example, so we know that some populations, the carrying capacity for some populations may be more restrictive than others, so that we don't negatively impact on other species through competition. So we're starting to think about the management of populations and population sizes in relation to the knowledge or the understanding of resources and availability of resources and the requirements of resources for populations to survive. Okay, K, so the carrying capacity varies over space and time with abundance of limiting resources. So when you consider space, different areas have different types of habitats that are more suitable for some populations compared to others. And consider time. If you just consider seasonality, for example, during the wet period, it's a lot more, resources are a lot more abundant for many animals compared to the dry periods or drought periods, for example. So the carrying capacity of an area can vary over space and time. In nature, for example, droughts, as I suggested, can affect the vegetation growing in an area, leading to a reduction in carrying capacity of herbivores. Perfect. And this is what it looks like. So an S-shaped curve. Remember we started with a J-shaped curve of population growth when it's exponential. Now you have what we refer to as an S-shaped curve. And we're referring to this S shape here that the curve makes. And what is that? It will be produced when plotting a population that is regulated by environmental limits over long periods of time. So as time goes by and you start to get this J shape over here, there are many factors that influence the growth of the population, and the population starts to slow down and then it starts to plateau. And at that point over there, you get an asymptote. You get the balance between the carrying capacity of the environment and the number of organisms that can be maintained. So you get that shape over there. Okay, we're going to talk about that now as well. The S-shaped curve shows the population's initial increase, which is that J shape at the start, when the environmental limits are few, followed by the leveling out of the carrying capacity of the environment. So that over there is referred to the carrying capacity of that environment for that population. And again, I stress that a population is a group of one species confined by a particular area that can interact with one another. An S shape or sigmoid, that's what that shape is called when you look at those logarithmic shapes, is a logistic population growth. That's what that shape is. So it's a sigmoid or S-shaped population growth. There are two types of population growth. First of all, if we consider you get an exponential growth model, which is the J shape, and nothing limits their growth. And then the logistic growth model, which is that sigmoidal S shape, which is where you get environmental factors and you get a carrying capacity that limits the growth of the population. And you can see here in terms of, consider human populations, by the way. We, up into the 80s, started getting up into this J-shaped curve where we started increasing by billions and billions of people. But now we seem to be getting to this point where we're starting to turn. So I think the human populations may just be on that edge over there, where we're starting to have the environmental resource availability start to affect our ability to continue to grow, and you're starting to get reductions in populations. And in many cases, for example, in Europe, in some of the first world countries, they've actually got a negative growth rate. So they're actually heading down, where some of the other regions like India and Africa and Asia, they're still increasing. So we're definitely turning from that J shape towards that S shape. Very interesting, but it explains the two models. Now consider population fluctuations, which are usually local, so it changes between different areas, and the resources for different areas are different. So consider that's why it can be different on local scales. Fluctuations of populations are driven by time lags in density-dependent factors. So density-dependent factors, we can explain that now, particularly birth rates and death rates. Changes in carrying capacity and other factors such as weather, predation, and competition affect these populations. Let's consider some timing. So fall or autumn, winter, spring and summer, those different seasons and the availability of resources over the seasons are very important in determining patterns for fluctuations of populations. When do they recruit? What resources are available for their recruitment? What drives a successful recruitment? What drives successful maintenance of species? What drives predation? What drives death? What drives resources and survivability, for example? And all of those variables can be linked to timing, to seasonal variability. Population trends in winter may not reflect the true carrying capacity of breeding habits or breeding populations. Okay, these are just dynamics that if you look at different times of the year, you may have this boom of populations in spring, for example, and then a lot of them may be predated and the population may come down for winter, and vice versa. The carrying capacity of all of the environment can influence population size during the breeding season. Yep, we've discussed that. Population fluctuations reflect the population's resilience. So what is resilience? So your or my resilience is my ability to withstand external pressures. So if you consider what are the fluctuation potential of a population and how it's influenced by the resilience of the population, consider vulnerable animals like sable antelope, roan antelope. They're very vulnerable to predation and they've got specific diets and habitat requirements. But if you consider something like an elephant, it's very resilient, it's very tolerant, very little. There are not many environmental variables and competition variables that can drive and influence the growth potential of elephant populations. So you can see that they're considered to be quite resilient, or as long as their food is available. They don't have as many predators, for example. Resilience is the rate at which a population returns to equilibrium after a disturbance has taken it away from the balance with its environment. And the more resilient you are, it affects that rate at which you can return back to equilibrium. So are you very vulnerable to change, or are you resilient to change? Resilient is the measure of how fast the population declines from the equilibrium and how quickly it increases from below that equilibrium. So if you're resilient, you can have something impact your resilience and your population can start to decline, but you can recover very quickly because you're very resilient. Or if you're not very resilient, if something actually starts to cause a decline in your population, it's very difficult to recover from that initial decrease in decline. And it's unfortunate because many populations have to be very, very carefully managed because they are actually considered to be not very resilient. And if you can consider some organisms that are very slow growing, very low fecundity or recruitment rates, it's very difficult for them to recover from disturbances, and the recovery is very slow, where some species can bounce back very quickly. Okay. Consider also reproductive rates of a population that influences resilience of the population. Size becomes important in influencing resilience. Small-bodied animals such as the minnow mouse fluctuate more widely than large-bodied ones such as deer. So many animals that have got very high turnover rates, you can have this so-called boom and bust process or phase where you can have a couple of individuals that can reproduce rapidly and they grow rapidly and they can reproduce rapidly, and you can have this boom in this population. And the whole population can go bust, can be brought right down, but then what's left of the population can boom again. But some animals, for example, like a large-bodied animal like a deer, they really struggle. When you start to put pressure on them, they've got to grow, they've got to reach maturity, they've got to start to reproduce, and the population growth is very gradual. And that's how it's possible for us, for human beings, to go into the environment and completely decimate some populations. You know, you can get into the bush, for example, and you could completely shoot out a lot of the populations because they don't have the ability to recover fast enough. And that's where this issue with rhino poaching is actually very serious, because at the moment, the ability for the population to reproduce and to recover the numbers that are lost due to poaching is available to us. So it's there. So they can recover from the numbers that are lost from poaching. But if the poaching becomes excessive, and it's almost at that point where they start to shoot out animals faster than they can recover, we will start to see a rapid decrease in the rhino population. And if they continue to poach, we may then have the serious issue of the rhino populations in the Kruger National Park, for example, becoming very vulnerable to extinction, for example, because you can shoot them out. Yeah, we've discussed that. They can die quicker and decrease dramatically from time to time. Small animals reproduce faster, yep, and as a result, small animals have higher species resilience. Size becomes important in influencing resilience. Large-bodied animals have high stability at equilibrium because they live longer and are less affected by environmental fluctuations. So, because of the long-lived animals, once a population and the mature individuals of that population are established, they can be very stable if they're not dramatic events affecting their populations. But some species that are small-bodied and have rapid growths may not recruit as quick. You can actually lose a large part of the population and it can recover very quickly. So you keep on going from this boom, bust, many individuals, few individuals, many individuals, few individuals over time. And yeah, that can drive the population rates. And you can see there would be a difference between an animal like an elephant that would grow up to a point and then they'd be very stable and they'd sit on that equilibrium line for a long time with little fluctuations. But if you've got a field mouse or a rabbit, for example, they can grow up and the population can have a massive turn and then they can increase quickly and they can come right up and then they can crash. And you can see you can have this, you don't have this stable population size. It fluctuates quite greatly over time. Yeah. Resilience refers to the time required for a population to return to equilibrium. Since no population exists in isolation, returning time can be influenced by interacting with other species. For example, if species A depends on species B for food, that's like the lion and the impala relationship, for example. Both species suffer from disturbances, so you get indirect impacts of one impact affecting the impala that then influences the lions as well. Species A cannot return to equilibrium until species B returns, for example. So that's why we have these life cycle issues where we call oscillations or cycles of populations, where fluctuations are more regular than one would expect by chance. So if there's a natural occurrence in the environment of the impala population increasing, and then the predator population follows the increase, and then the predator population gets too high, and the impala population starts to decrease. And then as the impala population goes down, the predators die off, and then the predator pressure is low, and the impala population starts to increase again, and as it's increasing, the predator population starts to go up, and as soon as the predator population gets too high, then the population comes down again. And you get this increase, this shape. So you can often get this oscillation or cycle between those populations over time, and they can continue on and on and on without any external disturbances. But generally, it is sustainable because those cycles occur over a long period of time. Okay, and it can include many years, 9 to 10 years for different species, for example, 4 to 5 years. So it happens over generations. All populations show some fluctuations in size, and it may be small fluctuations when elephants, for example, reach that equilibrium. It can be massive changes in rabbits, for example, that can fluctuate quite consistently over time. Such population fluctuations from year to year or place to place are called population dynamics. So what are the dynamics? Those are all those variables and those attributes of a population that's changing over time. That's considered to be the dynamics of that population. How does that population do it? It's its dynamics, how it changes and fluctuates over time. So it's often related to a specific place over a specific period and all those interactions. Okay, population dynamics focus on the interactions between biotic and abiotic. Biotic is living aspects of the environment. Abiotic is non-living attributes or aspects of the environment, and those factors that cause variations in population size. So you may have other organisms and attributes or the biology of your species within your population and the environment. What is the climatic conditions? What is the food availability? What is the habitat availability for different attributes, for example? And in rivers, we consider water quality, we consider flows and variables like that. Those are all non-living variables. So the living and the non-living variables together, those are all attributes that drive the variation or the changes, the differences in the population size. Okay, if immigration, remember immigration is the moving out of organisms from a population, and the emigration, which is the movement back into a population from other populations, if they offset each other, the population, then a population grows when the birth rate exceeds the death rate. So if these two variables, immigration and emigration, are balanced, same amount of organisms leaving as the amount of organisms coming back, then it's the birth rate that affects, if the birth rate exceeds the death rate, declines, okay, then it's the birth rate or the death rate that will drive the population. So there are two factors that affect population size: density independent factors and density dependent factors. Let's have a look. So density independent factors is is a birth rate or death rate that does not change with population density, but changes occur due to environmental factors. So when the number of organisms, when the number of organisms are not affecting that does not influence the abundance of a population itself. In other words, the number of organisms themselves are not influenced by using up resources, then it's considered to be density independent factors. Those are external environmental factors that can cause, for example, if you consider some organisms don't like cold environments. So it's got nothing to do with the fact that there are many organisms that are starting to compete with themselves within the population. It's got to do with an environmental variable like the temperature that becomes too low, and then those organisms are influenced by factors that are independent of the density of the organisms. Okay, they are sometimes very difficult to assess in nature because populations are exposed to a number of different factors that continually change. So those environmental factors like temperature, food availability, all of those things that are independent of the number of organisms within the population can be very variable, and there are many of them, and it's actually our job to go and figure out what could be causing these changes. But okay, let's look at examples. Include random weather events, drought, heat waves, cold spells, tornadoes, storms, floods, and natural contaminations such as silt or pollution, for example, that reduce population size. Resources such as food and ponds do not influence population size of mosquitoes, but winter influences their population size. That's a very good example. So the density of organisms in ponds and their food is not influenced by the number of mosquitoes you have, but as soon as the temperatures get too cold, then the population dies off. Heated water discharged from power plants may kill fish from a stream, regardless of the population density. Habitat destruction through roads, farms, factories, cities, villages, etc. often destroys all the species that once lived there, regardless of their densities. Okay. Then let's consider just finally what is density dependent factors. Now we're considering when the number of organisms within the population start to get too high, and the fact that the population is high itself starts to affect the density of the population. This is where death rates, for example, increase with population density, or birth rate that decreases with increased population density. So it's the number of organisms themselves that are influencing the growth of that population. This is where predation, disease, and competition are examples of density dependent factors. As I said, for example, with impala, as the impala population starts to go up, so the predation pressure goes up. So it's actually because of the number of impala that the predation pressure is high, and then the population collapses. Or there's too many organisms and they eat up all of their resources and the population collapses. Okay, let's have a look. If a species' predation becomes more numerous, predators may consume more of it, as I said. Secondly, prey species may be weakened or diseased because of competition and fail to escape predators when the population starts to get too high. Disease high population densities means that numbers will encounter one or more or other more often, and increase in chances of transmitting parasites and infectious diseases when the population gets too high. So as the population goes up, there's all these new problems that we're dealing with. And even human beings are dealing with those issues where we've got all these new things that we're dealing with that we didn't have before. It's just because there are too many of us. And that's what is considered to be a density-dependent factor influencing the well-being of our human communities. Consider competition. Increases in the population density may increase in competition for resources such as living space, food, cover, water, materials, and minerals, and sunlight. And that's another issue that human beings are dealing with. A lot of our wars and conflicts, like the conflict that we have been observing in Sudan and Central Africa, is primarily because of the limited resources and how people are starting to compete fiercely for what resources are available. And that fierce competition for resources has caused conflict and death. And that's referred to as a density-dependent factor. And unfortunately, that's what's going to happen. When we run out of resources, we're going to start fighting for the resources we have. And we see that every day in society. All right, what are the outcomes of the lessons, just to recap? Can you describe the differences between different types of population growth? Remember the J-curve shape and the sigmoidal or logarithmic growth shape. Can you explain what drives fluctuations in populations and cycles within populations? Can you consider, or do you understand the difference between density independent and density dependent factors that influence population sizes? Okay, that's it everybody for this slideshow, and thank you for listening. I wish I could have given it to you in person, but that's okay. I hope you guys can succeed from that. All right. Let's see if we can get there and how do I get back to that? I don't know. Okay, it could be